Welcome to Monarchist Minute. I'm Victor Smith. Today we are joined by a very special guest. He is a writer in both his native Norwegian and in English. He had a piece published in the Washington Times very recently. Let us put our hands together for J.K. Baltzersen. Tell us a little bit about yourself, sir.
Thank you. I'm a Norwegian, as you said, and I was born in Oslo many years ago, the town where Woodrow Wilson was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Whoa! And I live in Oslo right now, and I grew up in Norway and a few years in Nairobi, Kenya, where I attended an American-dominated international school. And I've been writing for LouRockwell.com, and some of my pieces have been appearing in a Canadian e-zine called Enter Stage Right.
That is awesome. So, Will, would you like to take it away?
I would like to start off with Churchill and his famous dictum on democracy. Do you guys have any thoughts on this quote, his dictum?
I think it pairs well with another one of his quotes. With the an argument against democracy can be summed up as a 5-minute conversation with your average voter.
It's the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter.
There's a small problem with that quote, and that's you can't find it in the Churchill archives. So
there's no
documentation that he ever said it.
That's kind of disappointing, actually. I wonder where it originates from, then.
Well, someone made it up, probably.
Hmm.
Well, the origin of the dictum on democracy, that democracy is the worst form of government except all the others that have been tried from time to time, is perhaps somewhat ironic. It originates from a speech in 1947 in the House of Commons. And at this time, Winston Churchill is the leader of the opposition. And the government has proposed to decrease the powers of the House of Lords further from what it did in 1911 with the Parliament Act of 1911, where the House of Lords lost its absolute veto, and it was replaced by a suspensive veto. And in 1947, Churchill speaks against reducing the suspensive veto time from 2 to 1 year. And that's quite amazing, because it's used to shut down debate on democracy, but it was uttered in a debate against further expanding democracy. Are you guys aware of this from before?
No, I always assumed that the quote came from the wartime era and it was meant to be sort of a stab at the dictatorships that they were fighting during the war.
Well, it came in the aftermath of World War II and at the dawn of the Cold War, so you could see it in that context as well.
Mm-hmm.
What's also interesting is that in the following year, in 1948, Winston Churchill publishes his first book in his 6-book series on the Second World War. And in this book, there's a lot on the First World War, in which he praises the Habsburg Empire not exactly your model democracy. And he compares the peacemaking of post-Napoleon Europe with the peacemaking of post-World War I Europe, in which he says the aristocrats back in the early 1800s did a much better job than the democratic politicians around 1919. What do you know?
And perhaps part of that was because the more experienced aristocrats had a more pragmatic understanding, whereas the democratic and populist elected representatives around World War I were simply out to create a peace deal that would make them look good.
Yeah, but it goes to show that even Winston Churchill didn't believe that all the other forms were worse than were worse than democracy in all aspects. Oh,
And perhaps that has to do with him growing up in a different time, being one of the few people left in politics who remembers the eras before the First World War at that
yeah,
point.
maybe. So let's move on to the vices of democracy. You guys have any
Yes, there's a lot of
yeah,
them.
you guys have any thoughts on what the worst vices of democracy are?
I don't
Well,
know.
the number
I
one
think,
worst one is that the number one worst is, well, we saw it in 2020 and to a lesser extent 2016.
and
If
now
your
that
candidate
20,
doesn't win, then complain about the process and the system and say, oh, it was rigged.
and now that it looks like 2024 is rapidly going to become round two of the 2020 election, I will say that the worst part of democracy is also its virtue, and that anyone can run for office.
I guess I would say that. Sorry, you two, for being late. I didn't look at the time. I'm currently in historic Fort Bedford Museum, Bedford, Pennsylvania. I suppose the worst virtue is because the system relies on whatever the majority thinks. There's this sort of majority opinion that hold on. This sort of majority opinion that whatever the majority decides is right. Unfortunately, I can't stay that long. Actually, I kind of had to get going. I just wanted to say, hi to our guest and hi to you all, and apologize for this episode probably not coming out at noon on Monday as is our custom. But I'm away for my cousin's wedding, so yeah. Hello all.
Greetings from Oslo, Norway.
Okay. Yes. All right. I'll be heading out now.
Chuck, this is JK. Chuck is our publicist. He's the person in charge of editing all the podcast episodes.
Well,
Yeah.
Oh,
what Charles York just said about the majority saying this and that must be good because yeah, the majority said so. Connects to something Alexis de Tocqueville said, and he brought up three vices of democracy or dangers with democracy, and one was individualism, and he feared that in America we would have a form of individualism where people minded their own business and then withdrew from public affairs and then let tyrants do whatever they please because the opposition to tyranny had withdrawn to minding one's own business. And the second one was order, that democratic societies, they demand order, and that opens the stage for a strong man. And the third one, which connects to what Mr. York said, is centralization, or the reliance on popular sovereignty as the source of power. And since popular sovereignty is the source of power, government is allowed to do almost whatever it pleases.
And it
But
does
wasn't
leave us.
yes, and popular sovereignty was first used by that I have no nice words to describe him, Cromwell,
Yeah.
and he essentially deposed the monarchy over in England.
And of course, Oliver Scumwell was succeeded by Woodrow Wilson, perhaps the greatest hypocrite in 20th century politics.
Yeah, someone once said that World War One let the poison that was the French Revolution unchecked upon the world. I think that's
I just
quite nice, or nice in quotes, description.
I just think it was possibly the greatest disaster in the history of mankind.
I agree.
Well, it's a bit of a stretch. I would say the French Revolution is a more immediate disaster, there's but World War II is a tragedy in and of itself.
And to backtrack for a second, I find the point on individualism very interesting, but for an entirely different reason. Because in my 23 years of life in the United States, I have noticed that individualism and democracy definitely conflict, but not for a reason that everyone minds their own business, but for a reason that people increasingly go to the polls demanding what they want at the expense of others. And that I've noticed that voters are increasingly selfish in demanding what they want from the government and not necessarily concerned about the needs or opinions of their neighbors.
Well, I think that's kind of how most, not really all systems, but how it really in democracy comes down to. Because when people who go into that voting booth, they're thinking about what's best for me. Why do you think when people vote, they're not voting for what they think is best for the country at some points, but mostly what is best for them? Why do you think
But
the economy is always such a massive issue in the United States? The economy is always the largest issue due to the fact people are worried about what's going to happen to them and their economic status. That's why people always worry about it, because it's what's happening with them specifically.
But of course, in a democracy, when we have popular sovereignty, we have a collective responsibility where our collective decision making doesn't just affect us, it affects our neighbors. And we can't, in a functioning democracy, we can't just think about ourselves. And that's part of the whole civic virtue, which, quite frankly, more and more Americans genuinely lack.
That connects to something Reagan biographer John Patrick Diggins said about the Reagan Revolution. As you probably know, Reagan uttered in his first inaugural speech that government is the problem. And what this Reagan biographer says is that he let the people off the hook, implying that only the government is the problem, not those who elect the government.
Which is a must, because in a democracy the government itself is created by the people, and therefore the people are directly responsible for the government they create.
Yeah, certainly.
Right. It is very certainly it is very certainly true that government has their hands in essentially everything, for better or for worse. I have no idea how the government of Norway handles things like stadiums and whatnot for sporting events, but in the U.S. state of Maryland, Maryland has its own special stadium authority that's in charge of that is technically in charge of owning the stadiums and doing all of the upkeep and maintenance. And right now, there is an issue with the managing director of the Baltimore Orioles throwing a hissy fit because the state of Maryland won't give him 300 million more on top of the already guaranteed 600 million that they are already receiving as half of the $1.2 billion budget.
And I would like to know how they justify spending this money and then letting the schools just run on scraps.
In Norway, we have
Well, the schools,
One at a time. JK, go ahead.
in Norway it's more decentralized, but still the government has their hands in everything. Yeah, and there's a lot of
It's interesting.
waste, and we even have a guy who started a Facebook page. Things like the waste, uh, the contra waste guy, if we translate it. And someone outed him, so now he's known by his real name. But he's been quite popular.
Now, remind me, Norway is a unitary system, right? Not
That's
a
right.
federal. It's interesting you say it's decentralized, given that it's a unitary system, whereas the U.S. is a federal system, and yet we see more and more
But
centralization to absurd degrees.
but I was comparing Norway with Maryland, and from what I understood, the state government had the ownership of stadiums across Maryland, and that would be more centralized than Norway if you compare Maryland with Norway.
I see my misunderstanding. I'm sorry. Now, Victor, does the state own the stadiums, or is it just like heavily subsidized?
I think the technically the state owns the stadium, but the team has to pay for the sort of upkeep costs of the stadium, and the team makes money off of events at the stadium.
Really? That's actually fairly interesting because in Ohio, sports teams own their own stadiums. They own the property and such, and any government money is simply subsidy.
Let me actually check that because you brought up a good point. Let me check.
But you see this a lot in the U.S. actually. Going back to the figures with the money, is that the U.S. government, our duly elected democratic government, shelling out millions and millions of dollars to private interests, and then public services go neglected. Fred, you were saying something?
No, he was just clearing his throat. Okay, Wikipedia. Apparently, let's see. It is a public corporation of Maryland which is authorized to issue tax-exempt bonds for financing operations.
Public corporation. Okay, so it's state owned. Well, no, wait, that means it's traded. Okay, never mind.
Are you aware of the kind of jelly beans contest where lots of people are gonna guess how many jelly beans in a jar?
I
Yeah,
remember I remember doing those in elementary school.
Occasionally in the U.S., like they'll do that at fairs or stores will do that for promotional things. But yes, I'm
Yeah, and
familiar
it
with
turns
it.
out that very often, if you have lots of people guessing and giving independent guesses, the average comes pretty close to what it really is. And yeah, and
Really?
some people use that actually to prove that that there's wisdom of the crowds. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, well, if there's a high end and a low end, by basic mathematical reasoning, the average is always going to be somewhere in the middle, and the more I'm trying to think of it from a statistical standpoint, the more input you have and the closer it gets to the actual answer, obviously, the more close the average is going to be. But just because the average is close to the answer doesn't mean that it's intentional. It's one of those correlation versus causation issues. They didn't get the right answer by guessing close enough that the average eventually comes out. That's just what happens, and it's completely unpredictable.
Yeah,
And it's
and the masses
I don't
who make these guesses, they don't make systematic errors. They're not biased in one direction. And lots of problems in a democracy have systematic errors that is bias in one direction. So it doesn't. So you
right, of
can
course.
actually use that as an analogy in many cases. But
Right, there's too many there's a difference in the variables between guessing a number and jelly beans and voting for a
yeah,
politician.
have you guys heard of the Condorcet jury theorem?
I don't think I
Condorcet
have.
was a marquis who lived at the time of the French Revolution, and I think he died in mysterious circumstances just before Robespierre was beheaded. And he came up with this theorem on mass decision making. And that is if you make mass is gonna make a binary decision, that is to choose between yes or no. And all the individual decision makers are independent of each other, then if the likelihood or the probability that each single decision maker makes the right decision is more than 50%, then as you increase the number of decision makers, the probability that the majority will make the right decision approaches 1. But the flip side of that is if the probability of making a right decision per individual is below 50%, it approaches 0. And that might be used as an argument that democracy works fine. But if you think about it, people aren't that independent of each other, so it might not work at all. But if you increase the number of decision makers, the probability that your vote will count goes down. So, all else being equal, your incentive to actually be knowledgeable goes down because the probability of your vote counting actually goes down.
And that feeds back into the percent chance of picking the correct answer. If you're less informed, you would be less
Yeah, if
likely.
you're less informed, then the probability that you would make the right decision goes down.
And when that goes down, it approaches 0 instead of 1.
If it goes below 50%, yeah.
Fascinating. Well, I did a few years ago. I was studying in the infancy of this movement. I was studying alternative methods for voting because there's been several key political figures in the U.S. who have been talking about reforming our first past the post voting style. And an interesting thing that was brought up about the statistics of democracy and voting is that always, regardless of voting system, the more people involved in the voting system, the less likely you're going to get a fair result.
Yeah.
So, you
I
met
met
Edward Habsburg.
Otto von Habsburg.
Oh, you met Otto. Yeah, of course. Sorry. You met Otto von
Well,
Habsburg. Tell
it
us
was
about that.
back in 2006, and I had been sending Christmas greetings by the old style mail to the Archduke, the Young Crown Emperor, and in 2006, I asked his press secretary, Demerle, if I could meet him. And it turned out that he was going to visit his daughter in Sweden to be support for her during her campaign because she ran for the Swedish Parliament. And so we made an arrangement that I could drive to his daughter's house in Sweden to do an interview. And I drove over and we sat down for 1 hour, and a short version of the interview is published on luwackle.com, and there's also a PDF version that's a longer version. Of course, I would have hoped for more than 1 hour, but most people don't get it at all. And that same evening, that same day, in the evening, he was giving a talk in a nearby town. And almost everyone at that event, they sat down. But the uncrowned emperor stood for the entire event. And he was, 93, 94 years old? And
That is very,
and
very
I went to his
inspiring.
funeral also in 2011. And I stood in St. Stephen's Square and sang the emperor's hymn, the imperial hymn. And also at the new market outside the crypt, I sang the Otto verse of that hymn. And someone looked at me very strangely. You were not supposed to do this. But I did it anyway. And later in the day, I met with Austrian monarchists for a memorial gathering.
Oh, and were you yelled at for doing what
Well, I
you
was
allegedly
not
weren't
yelled
supposed to
at,
be doing?
but someone gave me the look. That was all.
So,
Uh,
is
so
there a reason you're not
Well,
supposed to sing that verse, or?
I think it's Republicans don't like that because he was never de facto emperor. So a lot of people who
I see.
look at there are a lot of Austrians, I believe, that look at the monarchy as something of the past, and you can sing this song to remember the past. But if you make a statement that after the abolition of the monarchy, that the monarchy should be restored or give any sign of that, then that's something else. It might have something to do with that.
I didn't know if there was something more heavily controversial, because I know the reason that in Germany, just north of Austria, they don't sing the first verse of their national anthem is because it has
Well,
ultra
they don't
nationalist.
sing the first two actually.
Well, I know the reason they
only
don't
sing- they
sing the
only sing
first
the
is
first.
because it's very ultra nationalist, and Germans are very nervous about that. And I know the reason they don't sing the second verse is because the song was originally written by college students,
Yeah, and it
and
was yeah.
that verse is basically them drunk in a bar singing about girls and stuff.
Should we
Yeah.
move on to monarchical and constitutional history of Norway and Sweden?
Sure.
Sure, and as I would assume you're the expert in this
Well,
field, go ahead.
we can start with the Napoleonic Wars. In the beginning of 1814, there was the Peace of Kiel. And Kiel today is a German city, but at that time it was the capital of Schleswig-Holstein was a part of the Danish monarchy. And some Norwegians didn't like the Peace of Kiel handing the old monarchy of Norway over to Sweden. So, headed by the Crown Prince of Denmark, Norway, there was gathered a constitutional convention just north of Christiania, today's Oslo, to draft a new constitution. And this constitution is since 1974, when Sweden got a new constitution, is the oldest written constitution still in effect outside of the US. You have the Constitution of the Commonwealth of
Fascinating.
Massachusetts, the US Federal Constitution, the Constitution of New Hampshire, and the Constitution of Vermont. And those are the only four older than the Constitution of the Kingdom of Norway. And that makes the Constitution of the Kingdom of Norway the oldest written constitution of any monarchy in the world.
That is incredibly, you should be very proud of that. I thought you were going to start off with the Norwegian invasion of England in
Well, we can do another
1066 and
podcast for
That was
that.
stuff
the
like
800s.
But
Rex.
but when
Um,
they draft this constitution,
God,
they give the king on the executive side very strong powers. But as a matter of being involved in the legislative process and constitutional amendments, they make the regal power very weak. Now, can you come up with any reason why they would do this? You have any suggestions?
probably, probably to give the king power, but they want to sort of declare to the world, "Oh, we're the good guys. We're constitutionalists. We are all for the Napoleonic changes that are happening.
It definitely probably had to do something with
Yeah, that's
influence
probably
by the
part of it.
French revolutionaries.
Well, all this would be speculation to some degree, but one reason that has been debated, discussed, is that this constitutional convention was basically divided into two parties. These parties were not modern parties, but one of the parties was pro-union with Sweden, and one was pro having Prince Christian Frederick as the King of Norway. But both these parties probably knew that they didn't stand much chance against the big powers. So if they gave an absolute veto on legislation to the king, that would probably end up giving power to Sweden in a forced union. So that might have been part of the reason why they only gave a suspensive veto to the king and no royal assent required for constitutional amendments. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense to me.
Now, if I remember, during that time period, Sweden also got a change in leadership because didn't one of Napoleon's
Yeah, he's
lieutenants or generals, or I forget
Charles
his rank, end
John
up as King of
Bernadotte,
Sweden?
and he was a Napoleonic general, and there was a rumor that he had tattooed on his body "Death to Kings," and the story goes that he had to cover this for his entire reign because he had a tattoo. The story says he had a tattoo saying "Death to Kings," and he was himself a king.
I was
Yeah,
just
you're good.
always curious as to the
And
story
then
about how a
when
French
he, of
general
course,
ended
when
up the King
he
of Sweden.
acceded to the throne of Sweden, he also acceded to the throne of Norway. The constitution that was signed on May 17, and when also Prince Christian Frederick was offered the vacant throne of Norway. That constitution was replaced later on in the year after a short war with a constitution that was a constitution under a union with Sweden, which lasted until 1905. And one of the main leaders during the Constitutional Convention, his name was Christian Magnus Falsen, and in Norway he is known as the father of the Constitution. And many of the representatives at the Constitutional Convention, they vote the same as Falsen. There are stories that people say they don't vote for any specific thing. They just say, "I'm voting with Falsen." And on one issue, that is whether we're to have a unicameral or bicameral system, Falsen loses this vote in favor of a so-called modified bicameral system. That is, the parliament is elected as a unicameral system, but in cases of legislation and impeachment, parliament is divided into two houses. And those two houses are elected just after the election by the whole of Parliament. And this is what we get instead of what Falson proposes, which is a pure bicameral system. And yes, please.
That
And
same.
what happens is that Coulson does
sorry.
not adjust his design for the impeachment tribunal after losing this vote. And that has, well, very serious consequences 70 years later. Initially, Parliament meets every 3 years, and in 1824, the King proposes a number of constitutional amendments. They are all rejected, but the parliamentary committee concedes that the King has the right to reject royal assent to constitutional amendments. So even though the Constitutional Convention does not establish a veto for constitutional amendments, that actually is the practice during the period of the union with Sweden. Then we move on to 1866, when in Sweden the Parliament of Four Estates is abolished and replaced with a so-called modern bicameral system. In 1869 in Norway, the Parliament passes a constitutional amendment giving a parliament that meets annually, and this starts in 1871. And then the drama really starts in the 1880s. In 1882, there's an election, and this is referred to as an impeachment election. And what happens is that the opposition to the king refusing royal assent to a constitutional amendment is that the opposition wins so many seats in parliament that they can pack the impeachment tribunal. So the upper house, the so-called upper house of parliament, is filled with only their people. And so they have the majority in one of the houses, which passes the act of indictment. And then they have the upper house filled all with their people. And the impeachment tribunal is a mix of Supreme Court justices and the members of the upper house. And then the cabinet, which is then in real terms the king's cabinet, is removed from office through this purely political verdict in 1884. Any comments to this so far?
Seems very, this seems incredibly sensible, and it has all the makings of forming a post-Napoleonic system that works in sort of this post-Napoleonic world that we live in. Of course, I'm taking up a lot of the time by speaking. Does anyone else want to speak?
I don't know. I have nothing to say, to be honest.
I'm very interested in the story.
I know, yeah.
Because in U.S., we don't usually hear about this stuff, even in our world history classes. The only monarchy we hear about usually is the British one, and to a lesser extent, the Japanese
So let
one.
me.
And the Japanese one doesn't
So
really
I'll
become relevant
just
until the Second World
go
War.
on. King Oscar II
Just
then tries with appointing a new cabinet that is not a cabinet of the opposition. But in the end, in 1884, on June 26, I believe, he gives up and he appoints the opposition leader, Johann Sverdrup, as prime minister. And this is, in simplified terms, this is known in Norway as the establishment of parliamentarism or responsible government. But in the 1890s, there's a cabinet that sits through a vote of no confidence. So that is a simplification. And in 1905, there is the Norwegians want their own system of consulates. They don't want their own embassies, but they want their own consulates. Because they have a large shipping industry and they want representation across the world.
Hmm.
And, well, they don't. The embassies
But why
of
would they be
of
opposed to
Norway were
embassies?
during the union with Sweden. Norway and Sweden had joint embassies. So toward vis-a-vis the outside world,
Oh,
Sweden and Norway were one unit. So what they wanted now is they didn't oppose that system, the system of a common foreign
right.
policy, but they wanted their own consulates.
Oh, so they wanted consulates in order to
Yeah,
try
they
to
didn't want
get
the
away
influence of
from
Sweden
the
to
influence of
to
Sweden.
govern their shipping industry, because they had a large merchant fleet that they thought needed their own system of
Mm.
consulates. Yeah, but
Okay.
and of course, in
what happens
1905,
is that
Norway
the
gains
king
its
denies
complete
assent
independence. So how does
to
it go?
this bill, and the government resigns. The cabinet resigns. So the king is then without a cabinet. And in Norway, until this day, the king meets regularly with the cabinet, and he chairs the cabinet's meetings, which is different from the UK system, which, since the German-speaking kings, the monarch has been less involved in the cabinet's day-to-day work. Although some things need the king's formal approval, but
And
the
of course,
cabinet meets with the prime minister chairing it, and the king is not involved. But in Norway and Sweden, up until 1974, the king met in what is called the Council of State, which is normally once a week.
And of course, if Charles York were here, he would be extolling
and what
the
happens when
virtues
the
of
king is without
Jacobitism right now.
cabinet? the Parliament unilaterally states that the king is deposed and the union is dissolved. And later on that year, 1905, there are a couple of referenda. And on August 13, there is a referendum on the union dissolution. Now, if you guys were Norwegian gentlemen above the age of 25 at that time, what would you vote? Would you vote nay or yay? Yeah?
For the dissolution of the Union? Well,
But
it
it was a
depends. If I was a
referendum
Norwegian,
for Norwegians only.
I would vote for the dissolution. If I was a Swede, I would vote against it.
Oh,
Okay. Okay, so
Well, this
um,
you might
do I
have.
have any Swedish family? Okay. Um, well, if I have Swedish family, I would vote against the dissolution of the Union
Well,
because I don't want to have to get a passport to travel to see family in Sweden.
I don't know what I would vote for. I'm getting a lot of feeling that this is a very similar situation as Scottish independence. In fact, I feel like there's larger economic factors that I don't know at this point in time how it would affect
but you must
my
recall that
country if we
this is
were to
not just
lose the
about
union
the
with
dissolution
Sweden.
of the Union. This is also about the powers of the king compared to the powers of Parliament. Parliament has unilateral. You must remember that Parliament has unilaterally deposed the king.
And is now
So
trying
a
to.
vote for the king means that you're rubbing it in Parliament's nose that what
But
they did was illegitimate.
what the
A lot like what
question that
happened in
was
1688.
put forward in this referendum was a kind of question that sounds a bit like, have you stopped beating your wife? And what I mean by this is that the question that you were to say no or yes to was if you support the union dissolution that has taken place. And that's a very clever wording, because whether you voted nay or yay, you would acknowledge the legitimacy of the union dissolution.
And you acknowledge that it took place, that the dissolution. So basically, the only response
Yeah.
is not to vote
And
because
the final
you don't
result
recognize the
was
dissolution of this union.
184 nays and 99.95% yays. Well, there was, I mean, when you came to the
Because
poll,
the
there was
question was
Norwegian
worded
flags
so
all over the place,
confusingly
and
that
there was no doubt what was the right thing to do, what the right ballot was. I mean, you would call this today. You would call that a rigged election, right? A rigged referendum.
So right. So Parliament, if
excuse me
I'm
for a moment.
understanding this story
And
correctly, Parliament
if you
basically
compare the
rigged the referendum to
99.95%
gain independence from Sweden.
yeas to the Austrian Anschluss, that got only 99, only in quotes, 99.71%.
And that's really funny hearing, considering Norway has got one of the highest democratic ratings in the
And
world. That
there was this guy
its
who
independence came
wrote a
from what is
pamphlet
categorically could be
against
considered a rigged
the Act of
referendum.
Parliament, and he had to go to Denmark to get it published because no one in Norway wanted to publish it. Well,
Was
yes, you
that out
could
of
say
support of Parliament or out of fear of reprisal?
mostly support, but it might have been in some cases out of fear for the mob.
Hmm.
There were cases that people had to move to Sweden, and there were mobs that weren't exactly peaceful.
Trust me, we in the U.S. know all about that. First,
And
when it
later in
happens,
the year,
it's
in
kind of funny, and
November
then it doesn't stop, and then it
12 to
stops being
13,
funny.
there during the fall, there are no negotiations between Norway and Sweden on the dissolution of the Union, and it's formally dissolved on October 26, when King Oscar II abdicates the throne of Norway. And then on November 12th and 13th, there's another referendum. And is this a referendum any of you have heard of?
Perhaps, as I said earlier, when it comes to
Yeah, that's when it was
Scandinavian
decided if
history in the U.S., it
Norwegian or
ends at
English was to become a
1066.
world language. Well, this referendum in November is often presented as a referendum on monarchy
Wait,
or republic. But but that was not what the referendum was about. It
and
was
obviously,
about
monarchy won.
supporting Parliament inviting Prince Karl of Denmark to the vacant throne of Norway. And Prince Karl, later King Haakon the Seventh, he wanted this referendum. Now, do you have any thoughts of an incoming king wanting a referendum before accepting the throne?
It
Well,
does seem like a conflict of interest. If
it.
or
I know that. I'm sorry. I know that. Are we good?
yeah, I'm waiting on you.
Oh, you wait on me. Okay. Sorry. I have heard that Franz, Duke of Bavaria, said he would take the throne if and only if the people of Scotland or Britain or whatever wanted him to by popular vote.
We're Talking about Norway.
I know,
Well,
but that is the
there
only
are
analogous
there
example
are
I could think
problems of
of someone
principle
that
of
actually
having a
said that.
referendum on the monarchy, because if you don't accept popular sovereignty as the sole source of power, and and having a monarchy that has another source of power, then you might question that the concept of having referenda on monarchy. But if you look back at recent history at the time, only a few months back, Parliament unilaterally deposed the king. And the new king might say he was smart. He didn't want to be at the whim of Parliament. He wanted a separate mandate. Does that make sense? Then the new king is elected by Parliament on
Yeah.
November
A
18,
little bit.
and in the referendum he gets about 80%. And he arrives in the capital, his new hometown, on November 25th. And on November 27th, he gives his constitutional oath to Parliament. In 1906, he has a coronation, the last Norwegian one thus far. And in 1908, coronation is abolished. And there is also a constitutional amendment allowing Parliament to sit as long as it wants without the King's approval. Previously, it had to have the King's approval to sit longer than initially 3 months when Parliament met only every 3 years, and then 2 months when it met annually. But now, from 1908 onwards, Parliament can sit without the King's approval. And in 1911, a counter signature, which is the signatures of the Prime Minister, is what all the King's decisions made in the Council of State are signed by the King, and then it also has to receive a counter signature which is normally given by the Prime Minister. And in 1911, this counter signature is turned on its head, because the counter signature, or the King's signature, now becomes the de facto counter signature. And also, so-called military command issues are made subject to counter signature, which prior to 1911 they were not. The king had command over the military without the counter signature of the cabinet. And in 1913, King Haakon threatens abdication. Yes?
This
Because they wanted to emasculate him to a
what was the
very
reason he threatened
large
abdication?
degree. They in 1913 they removed his constitutional veto. So from 1913 onwards, all constitutional amendments were announced in the Council of State, but the veto of the king was removed. But he got to keep the orders. One example of an order is the Order of Saint Olaf. Got to keep those, and that's probably why he did not abdicate.
This does seem to be set up in the setting of something similar as we saw in England after the Glorious Revolution of Parliament, slowly but
Yeah,
at the
and
same time very meticulously
actually
setting up the
when
monarchy to be a
when King
puppet of the
Oscar
will of
was
Parliament rather
King Oscar
than a
II was
separate entity.
removed by Parliament, they asked if a prince of the House of Sweden could accept the vacant throne of Norway, and and King Oscar II, I believe, responded that he did not want any of his princes to become a puppet at the palace in Christiania.
I mean that just seems like, wow, you throw the man out of his union, out of the crown, and then you
Oh, if
try and
we
steal one of his sons to be your puppet king. That
yes, please.
rude.
That sorry. Oh, that I'm pretty sure that at this moment Charles York would be yelling about
We move
Jacobitism
on to
again.
1917. This is
The
Because
man
when
seriously
Sweden
needs to get a
gets
hobby when it comes to his love for
so-called
Jacobites.
responsible government. And in 1970, Sweden has its bicameral system replaced by a unicameral system. And in 1974, Sweden has what is called the Torekov Compromise. And this is when the Swedish monarchy gets perhaps the most republican constitution amongst all monarchies. Definitely in Europe. I would guess that the Japanese one does compete. This compromise makes the monarchy purely ceremonial, and the closest it comes to something that is not ceremonial is that he signs the credentials of the ambassadors and he opens parliament, which is very ceremonial still.
Like, if I remember correctly, the
That's
King of
probably
Sweden
true.
isn't even what's the word
And
I'm looking for?
he
Chief of
has
the
no
army.
involvement
He's not even the head of
in
the
government
armies.
decisions. He except for the
In any
credentials of
formal sense.
ambassadors, he he signs nothing.
That's really sad. And people around the world probably praise this, but that's just. I mean, I will give the
We
Scandinavian monarchies one credit. They at least don't have the ridiculous gag rule on their monarchs like Britain has on their royal
well, that's
family,
more or less how it works in Norway
where
too.
they're
But
basically not allowed to have opinions on anything because that would risk their
yeah, but
impartiality.
they have opinions, but not partisan opinions.
Really? I
And then
I see. And every time we hear about the UK, it seems like everyone's scrambling for some kind of subliminal message about what the
Yeah.
monarchs are saying about an issue because of how much
in
Parliament basically
1980,
keeps their mouths
Sweden,
duct taped shut about everything.
the very young Crown Prince Carl Philip is deposed. That is, female succession is introduced, and his older sister becomes Crown Princess. And in 1990, yes, please, yes, please.
Seems a little. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I
Oh,
think
that seems a
they
little bit
said that
unfair.
it
At
was
least in the
because
UK,
they
when
had
they
already
did
in
absolute
Sweden
primogeniture,
a
they didn't
constitutional
backdate
amendment
it.
is subject to 2 votes in Parliament with an election in between. And I think the reasoning was that before the Crown Prince was born, they had already passed the bill once. So they had started the process, and so they wanted to complete it. And in 1990, female succession to the throne is introduced in Norway. And
Okay.
the present Crown Prince is the younger brother to Princess Märtha. And they do not backdate it. So it's from his heirs and onwards. And also in 1990, the Parliament of Norway introduces eternal parliament. They put an end to the official closing of parliament, so it sits eternally, which Mark Twain from his grave would comment, "No man's life, liberty, or property are safe while the legislature is in session." And in 2006, we have a coronation centennial.
Ain't that the
And
truth?
on that occasion, a newspaper in the city of Coronations publishes an opinion poll where 18% say they want more power to the king. And for those under 30, they say roughly 30% say they want more power to the king. Now, do you guys have any comments on this?
Well, this is something we've been noticing across the board in the UK and in the US is that younger people seem to be increasingly pro-monarchist and or pro-stronger monarchies. We're seeing this in the UK, especially where the younger voters in Britain seem to want the monarchy to have stronger opinions and take stronger stances on things.
Only if their stronger stances and stronger opinions align with theirs, of course.
Yes, but that goes back to the big problem with democracy in the 21st century is that everyone wants what they want and they're
Yeah.
not afraid to be
It's also,
confronted
it's also a reason to
with
be
the
a bit
reality that what they
skeptical
want and what they
of
need
what
are two
people
very different
say in
things.
opinion polls. Of course, when you say that you want more power to the king, you're probably not vehemently opposed to that concept. But imagine someone calls you and asks you random questions that you haven't thought about before. Wouldn't you make up an opinion on the spot?
No, that I
Uh,
I don't know.
I am more well versed in people asking me questions I don't have an answer to, so I would be able to say I don't really have an opinion on this without feeling any sort of connection to magically form an
My
opinion
guess would be
as
that
can
a
happen
lot of
with
these
someone
people
who
who
hasn't
responded
had
that they want
this
more power to the
experience of
king,
studying politics in
they
university
have
and what.
bad feelings for politicians, and when a pollster calls them, they say, "Oh, I don't like politicians, but I like the king, so I'll give him more power." But as I said, they're probably not vehemently opposed or fiercely opposed to the concept of the of the king having more power, and that's a positive thing, in my opinion. And in 2007, parliamentarism or
It's a
so-called
step in the
responsible
right direction,
government is
definitely.
written into the
Something we can
Constitution.
work with.
How do you know that? We have a written Constitution, and our system of government, our separation of powers, which was established in 1814, hasn't been in effect in about 100 years. But they wait 100 years before they put it in writing into the Constitution.
And seems a little dangerous.
It seems like somebody saw that their
What?
power wasn't as invincible as they thought it was. We had a similar thing happen in the
Roe v.
US
Wade,
recently,
right?
involving a certain rights to abortion. Basically, we've had a similar. Yeah, right. So basically, we had a similar thing go about that where something that was implied as being part of the powers or rights, in this case, to compare it to what we're talking about, in a way that parliamentarianism wasn't technically enshrined in the Constitution but was the de facto truth. Federal guarantees to abortion wasn't enshrined in the Constitution but was the de facto truth. And so the problem is that pro-abortion advocates in the U.S. didn't rush to enshrine it into law, and that's when the Supreme Court
A
kicked it to the
problem
curb, and now
people who want
everyone in the pro-abortion caucus
to
in the
rewrite the
U.S. is running
Constitution
around
in
like
the
a chicken with their head
U.S.
cut off.
is that if they want something enshrined in the Constitution,
And they're getting really.
they not only need a supermajority in both houses of Congress, they need 3/4 of the states to ratify it.
And the thing is that technically they didn't need to go as far as to put it all the way in the Constitution. They just needed to legislate it
And then,
into law. That way, the legal
yes,
precedent
please.
would become law. So they just needed to get it through Congress. They just never bothered.
Well, yes. So I think there may be a lot of people on the left that may have said, oh, well, if all the states allow abortion, the federal government doesn't need to do anything. Oh, wait a minute. Abortion's no longer enshrined because of the Supreme Court? Oh, woe is me. We've got to get this abortion thing passed in every single state. And I believe even in Ohio, which I'm sure Will can attest to, is a more conservative leaning state.
Oh,
Uh,
we just finished having a special summer legislation to change our constitution because the conservative government was trying to write in a method to filibuster the
Politics is such fun.
pro-choice caucus if they win the election in the fall. Fun times in the USA.
yes, and you know what else is fun? Having such a wonderful special
My
guest to
pleasure.
teach us
Thanks
about
for having me.
the history of the
Then
modern Norwegian monarchy. And thank you so
in
much for joining
2007
us.
also
Seriously,
we
I am so happy
we
we
get
got to
a
have
pure
it.
unicameral system. So this modified
Right.
system from
Go ahead.
1814 is abolished. And then in 2014 we have
Honestly, it was
our
probably for the
constitutional
best because the
bicentennial,
modified system just seemed
in which
absurdly
the old
overcomplicated.
language from 1903, I believe, is replaced with something I would call street language. And then once between each election, there's also always the constitutional amendment to abolish the monarchy. And they do this every single time. Yeah. There's every and it fails every time.
Every time.
But the three
And it
last
failed every
times
time.
they've put a clause into the amendment that makes
Now
it
my
subject
question
to a
is, does it
referendum.
fail a little bit worse every
So
time?
it means if it passes with 2/3 majority, then there has to be a referendum that approves it. And I and they're far from that still. And I would like to tell a story about
And
King
it is
Olav
yet
and
go on.
seat belts. Back in the day when there were no seatbelt regulations, King Olav had read in the newspaper that the cabinet wanted to make it mandatory to wear seatbelts in the front seats. So, in one of his weekly meetings with the cabinet, he asks them, I've read this in the newspaper. Isn't this in conflict with individual liberty? And the story does not say anything about any response, and they probably don't respond. And some weeks later, the proposition comes to King Olav's desk, and he says nothing, and he says approved. And some people speculate that the cabinet is quite nervous when they bring this proposal to his table. But then time passes, and even though the king cannot be prosecuted for not wearing a seatbelt, he comes to his cabinet members, and he waves a piece of paper, and he says, "I tricked you." And he had gotten a formal exemption from the requirement to wear a seatbelt. And the story goes that King Olav never wore a seatbelt in his life. Well, you might say so. More diplomatic than
Just to
that.
basically spit in the
But-
face of Parliament. The only fun story I know involving seatbelts in Scandinavia is that it was invented by Volvo. That's all. That Volvo
that
chose not to
concludes
patent the 3-point seatbelt in order to improve
the
public safety in
section
cars
with
across the
Constitution
board.
and monarchical history of Norway and Sweden. How are we on time? Do you have time for more issues, or should we do that another time?
Thank you very much for that history.
I can go on.
Well, quite frankly, sir, that's
What
kind
thoughts
of up
do
to
you
you
have?
since you're technically later in the day than we
Yes, please.
are.
All right, then we
Oh,
shall go
this
on.
this is a conversation, so please go ahead.
So, God. Sorry, I was interrupting you. Go ahead. Oh, sorry. So it was the one thing that I noticed throughout all of this is the battling between the monarch and parliament. And it seems like Norway is on a path toward. Do you see many parallels between Norway and the United Kingdom in terms of, especially how their monarchs handle parliament and
I see a
whatnot, or
tendency
is there any sort
that
of and
the
when I refer to England,
the
I'm not
Norwegian
referring to modern
monarchy,
day. I'm
is
referring
becoming more and
to
more hands
more
off.
so the Georges.
Even though the modern Norwegian monarchy is based on the Badget three rights, which is the right to be consulted, the right to encourage, and the right to warn. The warning part, I fear, is becoming less and less used.
Mm-hmm.
But I have no. But this is just my feeling. I've never been in a cabinet meeting, so or an audience between the monarch and the prime minister, so I wouldn't know. But as we say, it's a place where I would like to be a fly on the wall. No, I have.
Yes.
Have you ever
So
gotten the opportunity to interview one of Norway
I
or Sweden's
once
kings?
many years ago wrote a letter to the Prince of Liechtenstein, and he
Oh,
actually
that's tragic.
responded.
perhaps
And the book that I've edited and contributed to, which is, if you translate the title, it
Oh,
would
that's
translate
interesting.
into Constitution and Liberty, Lovebirds or Arch Enemies. And it's a book that questions constitutions and democracy delivering liberty. And that book, I actually I gave one of those as a present to His Majesty, and I have the letter from his private secretary thanking me. What do you guys have any more questions on monarchy in Norway?
Oh, that's cool.
It is.
Sir, you have told us more than we could probably ever get from our education system. For that, I am infinitely grateful.
Yeah.
So let's assume, for the sake of
A future king, the
argument, that a
first
future king
future
of
king
Norway is
named
named Harold.
Harold after the present king would be
What number would
Harold
he
VI.
take as King Harold?
Excuse me?
Okay. All right. So,
There's only been
just
6 Heralds in Norway? That's surprising,
There's
actually.
actually been 6 Olafs.
There's only been 5 Heralds in Norway?
The last
That's
King Olaf,
surprising.
the father of the
I would have
present
assumed there
king,
would have been more, but...
had the numeral 5.
Oh.
Yeah, and there's some dispute with regards to one of them.
That's interesting. Why would he be Olaf V? Was it just bad counting? Hmm. I see a lot of parallels between, especially the Sweden-Norway Union time and the sort of Jacobite time in the UK. I see a lot of parallels there that I imagine if
We
Charles
can
York were
we
here, he would
we
be
might do that another
begging you
time.
to sort of expound on those and and he would be providing some parallels for you. It's a shame he's not here right now, but do you see any?
Yeah,
Yes,
what
we could
thoughts do
do that
you
another
have
time,
on
actually.
Liechtenstein and Monaco?
What were you? So let's see. I think we should move on to another topic.
I love the fact that Liechtenstein had the referendum to give its monarch more power and the people just casually said yes. I think it's hilarious. Because how upset and angry Republicans get about that. And then they try to what's the word I'm looking for?
Do you guys consider Liechtenstein and Monaco constitutional monarchies?
I can't think of the word to use. Delegitimize it by saying that Liechtenstein's basically a bump in the road country. I think the phrase we often use is
What's the definition of a
semi-constitutional,
constitutional
similar to the
monarchy?
German Empire or the Prussian system. They're not totally constitutional, but they're not totally absolutist either.
that neo-monarchists want us to believe that in order to be a constitutional monarch, you have to be someone who does
you
not
got me there.
involve him. You have to be
You got me
you have to have
there.
a monarch who does not involve himself in politics. And that would exclude all constitutional monarchies of the 19th century from the term constitutional monarchy.
Would
That is a fair point. I guess it's mainly, in this case, a matter of semantics, where constitutional monarchy is typically, at least in the 21st century, used to define a monarchy like those we see in Britain, where it's more ceremonial, whereas
Ceremonial monarchy and
semi-constitutional is
constitutional
generally used to
monarchy is not
define
the same.
monarchies like we saw in Meiji Japan or Jordan
And
today,
by the way,
where
in
monarchs had
the
a more
Constitution of
symbiotic
Liechtenstein,
relationship with their elected governments.
the prince has a right of veto against every bill of legislation, every constitutional amendment, except, and they can veto any referendum except a referendum to abolish the monarchy. And that constitutional provision was
Well, that makes
enshrined in the
sense. If they could
Constitution
veto a referendum to abolish
at that time
themselves,
when
there
there
would be
was
no legal
this
way to
referendum
remove the
to expand
monarchy.
the powers of the monarch. So that's fairly recent amendment.
Hmm.
I know a lot about the Monaco system, primarily because Grace Kelly is from Baltimore and she married the Prince of Monaco. So we hear a little bit
And that's
about that in
why
passing,
the present Prince of Monaco
especially
speaks
here,
English with an
but
American
we
accent.
don't really hear it much in history class. It's just a good historical footnote that we sort of cling to here. Precisely. We should get the Prince of Monaco an Orioles jersey.
You might actually
The
appreciate that. I idea of the Prince of Monaco speaking English with American accent reminds me of another funny historical anecdote that's not necessarily related to monarchy, but it's
Yeah.
funny.
But
Vladimir Lenin learned English from an Irishman, so there's a
back
very
to
high
this term of
possibility
constitutional
that he spoke
monarchy
English with an
and
Irish
even
accent.
absolutism. When people speak of monarchs that
It's
have
random, but
some sort of power, it's often referred to as a remnant of absolutism. Whereas when people speak about parliaments that have more power than most absolute monarchs, at least in Europe, ever could have dreamt of, almost no one speaks of those parliaments as absolute.
well, it comes down to and I will admit, America is a very, very big part of this phenomenon where people see parliamentarianism and democracy and republicanism as these new fancy concepts and monarchism as something out of a dark age. But in reality, republics and democracies are just as old as most of the world's monarchies, if not older. Republics go back
Yeah.
to Rome, democracy goes back to Athens, and there are probably countless of unrecorded republics and democracies from prehistory.
Besides, monarchy is the most
Have you
natural
guys
form of
ever heard
government
of the Austrian
in
writer and political
human
philosopher Erich von
existence,
Künigl?
because who is going to lead this gaggle of tribes if not the strongest person?
One of the things he comments on is the of course modern democracy and
I'm afraid not.
I've
the
heard of
secret
him. I
ballots,
haven't read any of his works.
and where citizens are dragged off to the polling stations, helpless, and made to vote by secret ballot. And then he says that in the future, people will laugh at our age, where we allow people with no knowledge, who are completely unqualified, to go in masses and make decisions at the ballot box.
I always thought the idea of compulsory voting seemed what's the word I'm looking for? Vic, do you happen to know the word? Like it's another word for conflictatory.
Uh, con- um, the only
There's a
thing that I can, the only thing
there's
I
a
can
very
think,
specific word I'm looking for, and I can't remember it. But the idea
uh,
of compulsory voting seems conflicts with the idea of democracy, the idea of forcing people to participate in a political system. It seems very conflictatory with the ideas of liberal democracy, yet countries like Australia
it's contradictory.
contradictory. It seems contradictory to the ideas of democracy, and yet
Well, it's
you see
not.
countries like Australia just practicing
It's
it
not
openly.
in.
It's like, how can you make someone want to participate in democracy? How
It's
can
not in
you
agreement
force
with
someone to
the
come to
idea
the
of individual
polls?
liberty, at least.
I know in the US, some people just don't vote so they don't have to partake in jury duty. And that's not for an actual legal reason that jurors
Well,
may only be taken from the legal voting
laziness in
population,
government. Who
rather that
could
the
have
US
known?
government is so lazy that they just use the poll of voters as the same system they draw jurors from.
He will cut it out of out of the podcast.
The American government has mastered the idea of, well, I can't use the word I want to use because Chuck will get mad because it's kind of a naughty term, but
He
I'm
has
known
been
to
no, he has been
But
known
have
to
you guys
do some
ever
very
reflected on the
scrupulous
notion of
censorship.
reserve powers?
and I am known to
Monarchs
have the
with
tongue of
reserve
a sailor
powers?
when not on the air.
Yeah, it's in
Well,
connection with political emergencies,
yes, I think
etc.
the monarch should have lots of sort
So
of
so if
reserve
let's say
emergency powers. Well,
politicians,
I think that's not
uh,
what you mean.
some guy like Hitler or Mussolini comes in, have reserve powers
Okay, so
to,
I was right.
so to
So,
speak, protect
yes,
democracy, or if politicians go too far and in some sense, to protect the Constitution.
Mhm.
Well, it seems logical.
Hello, I'm Charles York. Unfortunately, in this section, it seemed there was some sort of glitch where two people were talking and each didn't know that the other was talking because both people were just talking as if he was the only one recording or only one speaking. So, what was actually some interesting statements from both Will and our guest had to be cut because you can't particularly comprehend it. Apologies.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us of our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen. Heavenly Father,
Thank you
please
very,
protect our guest as he goes about his days, and bless his future endeavors. Amen.
Thank you very much for that. If you would like to join us live for Monarchist Minute, you can do so on Fridays at 8 p.m. Eastern. Well, at least normally, if we have another special European guest, or if JK comes back, we'll be recording earlier. But in any case, if you'd like to join us live, you can join us at our Discord server, link in the description, as well as follow us on all of the various social media platforms. Links to those will be in the description, and a link to our website will also be in the description. Until then, may God bless you, and may God bless the United States of America.